Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Your Mark on the World show. I'm your host, Devin Thorpe, and our guest today is Laura Dunn. She's the founder of SurvJustice. Laura, welcome to the show.
Devin.
Laura, I'm thrilled that you would make time to be on the show. Quite honestly, most of the people that are on the show have pitched me an opportunity, and I'm so glad they do because it makes my life much easier. But I reached out to you because of the important work you're doing and the tremendous success you're having as a social entrepreneur. And so I wanted to just get you on the show. First off, let me just introduce what you're doing by saying that SurvJustice provides support to victims of campus sexual assaults of all sorts. But one of the primary things that you do is to provide essentially legal help to victims. And, you know, as I think about it, it isn't intuitive. It isn't obvious why victims of sexual assault should need attorneys or legal counsel. What is the situation that makes that so important? And why do you need to exist?
Well, thanks for that question. There's definitely a norm out there of accused of sexual violence getting attorneys, but we're trying to create a norm where victims themselves are seeking legal support. And the reason for that is because victims actually have significant rights within federal law on campus. A lot of people have talked about Title IX, which is a civil right preventing sex discrimination, but there's also the Clery Act, which gives both students and employees rights. And so we really are encouraging survivors to advocate for their rights because unfortunately the process is not very fair. We're seeing a lot of cases in the media of schools that are covering up sexual violence or giving preferential treatment to those accused, perhaps because they're an athlete or some other higher status. And so as a result, we are really working and getting in there to support survivors to make it fair, to honor their rights, and ideally get a positive outcome.
What is a positive outcome after going through something so traumatic? What's the best case scenario?
That's a great question. So one of our values is actually to allow survivors to define what justice means for them. We, of course, measure it on a scale of accountability. We believe those who commit sexual violence, as well as those who are enabling it, encouraging it, or covering it up, should be held accountable in some way. We often are seeking that through the campus process because Title IX does require schools to hear these cases and address them, but sometimes that's through the criminal courts or even civil litigation. And sometimes none of those work, and we go into the media and we draw national attention or we seek policy and legislative reform. We really kind of have an expansive view of a positive outcome, and every survivor gets to choose what that looks like in their case.
You know, the Brock Turner case has been getting extraordinary amounts of national attention. And it strikes me, based on some of the things you've told me and I've heard from others in your situation or similar situations, that what's interesting about the Brock Turner case is really not how little punishment he got, but in some ways how much. Because some men accused of doing the same things, even some of those found guilty of the same things, have received far less punishment, like a summer suspension from school. How does the Brock Turner case resonate with you as being either typical of or different than the norm for what you're seeing?
It's a great question. A lot of people were outraged by how short of a sentence he had, 6 months. And of course, he was released in half that time because of good behavior. But the reality is most cases don't even end with a conviction. We often hear the conversation of, why are survivors going to the school and not just police? Well, the criminal justice system is effective about 6% of the time, and that's for reported crimes. And we know that only a minority of students, about 20%, are even bothering to report because they had that little faith in the system. So the fact that it ended in conviction is impressive in itself, but it's a typical case of privileged student, white male, who's an athlete, who's valued, often does get preferential treatment. And we see that in campus hearings, as well as civil courts, as well as criminal courts. Unfortunately, justice is swayed by the amount of privilege someone has. So I'm glad that it was a flashpoint for a conversation, but it really should awaken people. The criminal system is just as broken, and we're actually making more progress in the campus system than the criminal right now.
Now, there was a nuance in that case where he was not guilty of rape. What's the nuance there that meant that he wasn't guilty of rape?
There are a lot of different state laws in every single state that define sexual misconduct, sexual violence, and they have different terms and ways that they quantify. And we've seen cases all across the country where some type of sex offense is found, but maybe it doesn't have the bright red category of rape put over it. We see the same thing happening at the campus level. A lot of schools don't want to call it rape or sexual assault. Maybe it's sexual misconduct or gender-based misconduct, or the worst of the worst, non-consensual sexual acts. So I think it's just a pattern within this, that there's a lot of ways to kind of circumvent the true horror of what sexual violence looks like by different misnomers, different names.
Yeah, non-consensual sexual act makes it sound like someone put salt on your salad without asking. Not a fair characterization of the crime, is it?
Absolutely.
In Utah, where I am, there's an interesting set of cases have popped up lately at Brigham Young University, and this is tied in some ways, perhaps, to the school's long-standing honor code. The honor code has been in place for generations, and it is intended primarily to discourage extramarital sex of all types. And so the school would certainly, and has certainly argued, that it's intended to discourage rape as well as all other kinds of extramarital sex. But some have argued recently, and with some compelling evidence, that the conduct of the police in Provo and the Title IX office and all in sharing information have had the effect of punishing victims. What's your take on what you've learned about what's going on there at BYU?
Absolutely. So that case is actually emblematic of issues we've seen all across the country, but more so in religious-focused schools than any other. Oftentimes, survivors are afraid to come forward for a variety of reasons, one of many being they may have committed some other crime or misconduct. Maybe they were doing drugs illegally, drinking underage. In religious kind of schools, they have even higher standards, like you mentioned, no premarital sex, perhaps not being in a room or a dorm at a certain time. And so because there is no amnesty, no kind of intentional decision to ignore minor offenses and focus on the most egregious, the sexual violence, we see a lot of survivors choose to be silent. So this case is really emblematic of a system that isn't putting sexual violence at the forefront, and to equate, again, consensual sex outside of marriage to sexual violence and have us act as if they're similarly egregious is very offensive, and it's very discouraging. Obviously, most people, when they're accused of sexual assault, simply say, well, it was consensual. And so just opening your mouth at all risks it going either direction, potentially. And so most survivors just choose to move on, to ignore. And unfortunately, that means students who are predatory and most often are repeat offenders know that it's a safe environment to do it again and again and again. So it's a very horrible case, but I'm glad that there's such brave survivors speaking out and saying this needs to change.
Why is there such a problem with repeat offenders? It seems surprising that perhaps 90% of campus sexual assaults are from the same group of repeat offenders. Why is it so hard to stop them?
A great question. So often in society, we're focusing on rates of victimization, and we've had people dispute the 20 to 25% of women who are being victimized on campus, and it's the wrong focus. We really should be looking at those who are perpetrating, and Dr. David Lisak is one of many researchers who've looked at this topic, and he's seen that it's a very small minority, somewhere between 6 and 12% of any male student population, that just happens to dominantly be repeat perpetrators, and effectively about 90% of campus sexual assault are repeat perpetrators. And now that we're actually testing rape kits for criminal cases, for acquaintance assaults, we're seeing the same pattern. A vast majority are repeat offenses. So it really is that our society used to ignore and excuse acquaintance rape as just a one-off, a miscommunication one time. And they thought in their minds that stranger assault is repeat, it's violent, it's different. But the reality is sex offenders, whether they target someone they know or a complete stranger, act the same. They do it again, and they're very intentional. They're selecting people who are vulnerable that they can isolate. And unfortunately, as a society, we haven't changed our thinking about how to investigate and look at these cases. In fact, we've gotten so caught up on victim behavior that very rarely are the accused ever even meaningfully investigated.
It seems like those repeat offenders, coming back to the BYU situation, could be using the Honor Code and a young woman's fear of being kicked out of school to perpetrate the very act that the Honor Code was designed to prevent. Is that
absolutely
possible?
And I think that's absolutely reality. Offenders don't just use physical force, they'll use incapacitation, they'll use a system flaws such as not offering amnesty to survivors, and they'll then intentionally choose people that are in those vulnerable conditions, those vulnerable states, the ones that have broken the rules, to then make their move. So it really is leaving an advantage to those who want to harm.
Well, Laura, you really are a role model, and you have had tremendous attention. You had the opportunity to do some remarkable things. I think you worked with Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, on an initiative back in 2010, and you've had kind of a storied history since then. That makes you a role model, I'm sure, to a lot of women especially, but to everyone. Who do you look up to as a role model?
It's a great question. I think the person that I looked up to the most going through everything was actually now one of my board members, S. Daniel Carter. He is a longtime campus safety expert, coming up on 30 years soon. And he just had a heart for the issue. He dedicated his life early on in college and really has turned around and mentored others. And I am blessed to be one of those people that he selected as not just being a survivor whose case needed to be heard, but he saw potential for me to change the national landscape of how we do these issues. And he's really supported me, and I'm very honored that he's on my board, helping take us to the next level and really kind of maximizing that impact. We're able to help hundreds of survivors every year. So I look up to him for being a dedicated, committed activist who has persisted despite limited resources and limited attention in the past to this issue.
Well, I appreciate that great example. You had the experience of being a victim of campus sexual assault. I presume that has a high correlation or a connection to your passion for this and why you are now leading this effort, that influenced probably even your decision to become a lawyer. But most women who go through what you've been through don't in fact become advocates, activists, and attorneys. They move on. Why did you feel so compelled? What about your experience, your situation compelled you to become a crusader?
Well, I remember back when I was going through it as a survivor, I really was desperate for assistance. My case was reported criminally, it was reported to campus, I got a civil attorney. I was looking up and down for any resource to help me, and I found hotlines and support and counselors, all of which exist today, but I found no legal help, no legal support, no one who is ready to advocate against a very powerful institution who is bent on not giving me justice. And I remember exactly what that felt like. So I wanted to make sure no other woman or other survivor, no matter their status, went through that ever again. I think it was just a glaring hole in victim services, that there was not legal assistance. And if I was able to make it through and to learn everything and have the impact I had just on my story, I thought I could do that over and over again for other survivors. So I decided I was blessed with the burden of being able to make it through, and therefore I wanted to give that to others.
Which was worse, as you look back on it, the actual sexual assault? And I realize this is a terrible comparison, but it would help us to understand, those of us who haven't experienced it. Was the sexual assault worse, or was the frustration of the institution you thought would protect you and help you, ignoring you and working against you? Which was the more frustrating of those two, or which was the most, how would you compare and contrast those experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a perfectly appropriate question. I think almost every survivor who's attempted to get justice will give the same answer. No matter how traumatic and harmful the actual sexual violence was, the re-victimization from the system, from those you turn to, is unparalleled. You grow up in a world where you think, if something bad happens to me, I'll tell my family, I'll tell the police, I will have support, I will be supported. And that is not the case for survivors. Oftentimes they're turned away by police, they're blamed by the university, sometimes even family and friends turn their back. It's really a long-term impact that really makes waves, and I'm so thankful to see change socially. We're seeing a lot more support publicly of survivors, and that's hopefully taking away a lot of the sting that sexual violence, the ripple effect it has. But hands down, the system is unfortunately worse than the violence, and that's why so few turn to it right now. And we're trying to change that by giving legal support and fixing that system.
Laura, you have accomplished so much in such a short period of time. I want to ask you what we ask all of our guests, and that is for an impact hack, some tip that would help us to do more good in the world. What's your impact hack?
I think to do more good in the world, it really is a matter of investing in knowledge. I make sure that all the time I'm giving the next book, listening to the next interview, sitting in the next conference, and constantly seeing more and more ways that the same issues intersect. We've had a great movement of intersectionality within feminism and feminist theory, and we're seeing now that, for example, the Brock Turner case, it's not merely that sexual violence, gender violence is not being addressed. It's also white male privilege being favored within the system. So I think the best way that everyone can make an impact is to keep expanding your base of knowledge and then taking that time to integrate it, because we all need to support each other in this. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I truly believe that in my heart.
No, thank you. Laura, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Before you go, please tell us how people can connect with you, how they can learn more about SurvJustice, heck, how they can help you.
It'd be great to have people reach out. We want to support anyone who's going through this, and we, of course, want more support from those who are moved by our mission. The best way is our website, and our organization is SU, as an umbrella, rvjustice.org. You can reach out, of course, through social media, Twitter and Facebook, or you can just email us at info@survjustice.org.
Fantastic. Laura, thank you so much for being with us today. We wish you every success in changing this terrible epidemic of sexual violence on campus.
Well, thank you again for having us on.
All righty. Let's do some good.